with a focus on Egyptian chronology. So let me just quickly start with a couple references in the New Testament, picking up from some reference from Luke and as well as from Stephen in Acts. So we read in Luke 16 and verse 29 that Abraham saith unto them, they have Moses and the prophets, so let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to them, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. So here we have in the New Testament talking about Moses and Abraham as if they were real, actual characters that existed in human history. Again, Luke 24 and 27, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures of things concerning himself. So our Lord Jesus Christ went back to Moses and the prophets and said, these are all the things they spoke about, pointing towards myself. You know, I know Brother Bernard does some classes on looking at how Christ and Paul and other New Testament writers talk about things in Genesis as if they were factual things. They believed they actually happened. And then the onus then comes upon us to make the choice of whether or not we believe the same things the Lord Jesus Christ believed. And again, in Acts 7:36, the Apostle Stephen says, as he goes through his history of Israel, he brought them out after he had showed them wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. So here's Stephen as he's debating and telling the Pharisees and scribes that these things really happened, that Israel really was in Egypt. They really came out. They went over the Red Sea. They went up to the wilderness for 40 years before they came into the land of Canaan. So these writers, these apostles, and our Lord Jesus Christ all believed in the authenticity of the Old Testament. And that's really how it's been for a long time. But in the past, other than obviously if you're an atheist or a humanist, but in the past 50 to 100 years, even Bible believers are starting to look at this a little bit differently. And they started to look at the Old Testament, at least the first 5 books, as parables. Not in the sense that they are actual events with hidden meaning, but that they are just fictional events that God shares with us to give us moral lessons. And that's sort of where many around us think. And the archaeologists who used to read their Bibles, and they used to be Bible believers. They'd read something in the Bible and go over to the Middle East and try to find it in the ground. Oh, I read about this. I want to find it. I read about Babylon. Where is it? And they go and look for it. And lo and behold, they dig it up after a fair amount of time. But recently, I say recently, again, the last 50 years or so, that paradigm has shifted. It's not people looking in the Bible first and saying, oh, God says these things happened. Let's go find it. Now what they do is they go to the ground first and say, look, here's what we find. If the Bible agrees with it, fine, so be it. But if the Bible disagrees with what I found in the ground, well, the Bible's wrong, and they immediately discard the Bible. And that's sort of the shift in how archaeologists around us, again, there's always exceptions to that, but most archaeologists and the so-called learned men look at their studies over in the Middle East. And so what we're going to try to do is look at some of the ways they've gone wrong and why they can't seem to find things that God actually has left for us as God continues to reveal things, not only in the Word of God, but it is there lying in the earth for us to see. So we're going to, as Luke said, stick to the time of the Exodus. Now we're not going to look at the Exodus journey, either of these classes or the Red Sea crossing, although I do find that to be a wonderful topic and something that is discussed widely these days. That happens to be the route that I believe that the Exodus took. You might look at it as they went down over the Suez, which is totally fine as well, into the Sinai Peninsula itself. But the point of it is Moses really did take Israel out of Egypt, out into the wilderness, and up into the promised land. These are things that really happened. But when we look at, again, the top minds of the day, this is what they are saying. And it's not just the ones who are atheists or the ones who don't believe in the Bible. It's even religious ones who say these things. So archaeologist by the name of Zeev Herzog, he says, talking about the Exodus, it's a history that never happened. Bill Deaver, who was a Christian archaeologist, he was a Bible believer. He's since changed his way of looking at things. He no longer calls himself a Bible archaeologist. He's just an archaeologist. He says, speaking about Jericho, that Joshua destroyed a city that wasn't even there. And then Israel Finkelstein is a very well-known archaeologist in Israel. He's obviously Jewish. He is a Bible believer. He believes in the things of being one God, all that stuff. And he's very much calls himself to be a biblical archaeologist. But these are his comments about the Exodus. He says, there was no mass exodus from Egypt. There was no violent conquest of Canaan. And something clearly doesn't add up when the biblical account, the archaeological evidence, and the Egyptian records are placed side by side. So it's not just looking at the Word of God and trusting and believing our Heavenly Father. It's I take the Bible, then I take the archaeological evidence, and then I take the Egyptian records. These are the things I'm going to compare, make sure they're all in line. And where they don't line up, the first thing to go is the Word of God. And it's really unfortunate, but that is what we see in the world around us. Now, I want to play two clips. One of them is from Mr. Finkelstein and a couple other people. And you might want to turn your volume up. They're not super loud. I'm not an expert when it comes to transferring audio. So the first one is a clip from Israel Finkelstein. There's a bit about him. You could read it. He's a well-known professor of archaeology in Israel. The second one is from Norma Franklin. She's, again, another archaeologist who works over in the land of Israel. And she's not a minor student. She's been in the field for a very long time. She leads teams, well thought of as well. So we'll just quickly listen to what they have to say about Israel and the Exodus.
Exodus did not happen in the way that it is described in the text on the background of the 13th century BC.
I don't believe there was a single event that we can call the Exodus archaeologically or historically.
So here's two, again, well-known archaeologists, and that's what they are coming up with. And they're not in the minority. This would be the majority view amongst the learned men and women of our day. Next guy we're going to look at, he's a rabbi. Now, this is from a few years back, 15 years ago. But his name is David Wolpe. He's the Max Webb Senior Rabbi at the Sinai Temple. He was named the most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek magazine. He was also named one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post. He's a rabbi at the Sinai Temple in LA. He previously taught the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, and also the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, Hunter College, and UCLA. So this is a man who is a rabbi. He's well regarded, obviously well followed. So this is not just a Jewish man. This is a Jewish leader. He's a religious leader of the nation. And obviously he has to give classes and services every week, and he talks about these different things. Obviously a big focus of a rabbi is performing the Passover feast every year with your people. And a few years back, he had some pretty radical things to say when it came to the Passover and obviously the story of the Exodus. So again, just listen and we will see what he had to say about those events.
In 2001, Rabbi Wolpe created a national furor when his Passover sermon challenged the historical reality of the Exodus. Rabbi Wolpe, what did you say? I said that the Exodus certainly didn't happen the way the Bible depicted, assuming that it was a historical event in any description. I think that if you look at it scientifically, it's virtually indefensible to make the Bible's case. But you also have to understand that your faith isn't based on splitting seas or archaeological digs. It's based on something much deeper. But if these are not facts, if this is a fairy story, if this is fabricated somehow, doesn't that undermine the religious meaning? In other words, doesn't that change the extent to which it has a historical core is very hard to say, but my deeper conviction about it is that it's a story that whether it was true, it is true. And those are two different things. That seems to be... Well, in other words, things that aren't facts can be truths. What part of the Torah would you grant to be based upon historical reality? I can't tell you. I don't know. And although it may irk people, I don't care. If the leadings come.
So here's a senior rabbi giving his Passover sermon, and he talks about the Exodus not being an actual event. And I smile every time I hear this clip when he talks about things like things that are facts are not necessarily truths, etc. So this is his belief, and here he is. He's believes in God. He takes it very seriously. It's his life. He still celebrates the Passover every single year, but he looks at those teachings in Exodus as moral things. Again, parables. So these are ways that God can communicate to us on how we need to live our lives, how we need to conduct ourselves, how we need to think, all those kind of things. And that's where they leave the Exodus. And it's because, like he says, when you look at science, which includes not just things like creationary sciences or physiology, but also archaeology being a science. When you look at those things, he says, look, there's no evidence for it. There's no way you could prove the Bible in that way, in that story time. So these are the people around us in the world today, and that's what they're saying. And it's not just, again, the atheists amongst us, it's also many of the religious people among us who are disregarding these stories. Here's a quote from a man named Matthew Sturgis. He says, if the children of Israel did not sweep into Canaan and conquer it, did they ever escape out of Egypt? Did they ever cross into the wilderness? And indeed, were they ever even in Egypt? And this is the slippery slope that we go down. It's one thing we say, okay, the Exodus didn't happen. They didn't conquer Jericho. But if the Exodus never happened, they never left Egypt. Were they ever even in Egypt? So now we go back to Jacob and Joseph. Did that ever happen? Were they ever real characters? How about Isaac and Abraham? Did they exist? Or again, were they parables? And although I don't face it so much in my area of the world, I do know that oftentimes you guys face this stuff about theistic evolution and how it affects our faith and how it takes, again, the beginning of the Bible and turns it into allegories and parables. And this is the same kind of stuff. They're taking the same information and making it a parable. And you can see the connection between those two groups and how they would grab onto these same things to try to prove their views on the truth. So that's a whole bunch of the negatives, how the world looks at these things. So let's now look at some of the evidence that they use to prove what they believe and see if we can find evidence that God's word, which we know is true. So there's always been two basic views on the Exodus period. They call it, there's an early Exodus and a late Exodus. That's sort of been the view for the last 120, 150 years in archaeology. There's obviously debate back and forth all the time about which one is accurate. So if you go with a late Exodus view, you get Ramses II being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and there's his mummy on the screen. And if you go with the later Exodus, the earlier Exodus view, then you come to Pharaoh Thutmose III, and that's his on the right. Now the Ramses view is the one that's probably most predominant. Famously, we had movies about it in the last 60 years. The movies by Cecil B. DeMille with Charlton Heston, etc. They depict Ramses as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And that's, if you ask most people, that's probably going to be their answer, that Ramses was the Pharaoh during the time that Moses left Egypt and the plagues, etc., all happened. Here's a nicer picture of the other Pharaoh. It's one of his busts, instead of looking at his yucky mummy. So, but these are the two ideas, and they go debate it back and forth and look at the timelines. I think, oh, how does it fit better? You know, how does that mix in with the 480 years that between until we come to the fourth year of Solomon's reign in Chronicles? So how does that all fit together on a timeline? And these are the arguments. But what they've found as they look at these two timelines, right, the early and the late Exodus periods, when they go digging around the earth in those time frames, so looking at this, how far down they are, at the pottery, etc., they have found no evidence for Israel leaving Egypt in those time periods, in the reigns of those particular pharaohs. And since they're very firm on that it has to be one of these two, probably the later one with Ramses, but one of them has to be the Exodus, and they find no evidence, so they say, look, that's a pretty major event. If I have no evidence, I can't find anything, no inscriptions, no pottery, nothing to show this mass amount of people just leaving Egypt and going wandering around the woods for a while, then obviously it's not true. Because I found evidence of the pharaohs, but there's no evidence of the Exodus. And so they use that then to discard it. And one of the things they go to show that, beyond just looking at Egypt, they also go look at Jericho. Because if they know when the Exodus would have happened, then they can go to Jericho, which is a dig that's active, actually active again today, and they've done a lot of work in, and they can go dig around there and see what Jericho was standing at when Joshua would have crossed over the Jordan River. So when they put a timeline of Jericho on a map, they can find different things going on. So on this timeline, you've got the different dynasties in Egypt. So at the top there, you have the 21st dynasty and then go all the way down to the 18th dynasty. So depending on where you want to fit in Pharaoh, so this one's going to be using Ramses II, which is, again, the more predominant view of where the Exodus had to take place if you took a timeline and apply it that way. So when they go down to Jericho, like, okay, I need to look between 1300 and 1200 BC to look for what happened at Jericho when Joshua came across and defeated the city. So as they've dug around, they found in the 20 and 21st dynasty, they find a small town existing at the site of Jericho. Then when they go back to the sojourn period, and their timeline of when Joseph and his family are down in Egypt for those few hundred years, they found again evidence of homes and dwellings in Jericho. So they have these points in Jericho where they see it's being lived in, there's walls, it's a prosperous city, all that kind of stuff. But when they look in the time that they believe, again, fitting their timeline, that Joshua would have crossed the river and came to Jericho, what they find is nothing. They found that, look, Jericho existed way down here in 1350, 1400 BC. It existed in 1100, 1150 BC, but in the time of Ramses, Jericho does not exist. It was in the city. So if Joshua came across and this whole thing in 7 days and the walls came down and Rahab came out, well, it couldn't have happened because Jericho wasn't a city. It wasn't somewhere people were living. And so because they see that, they go, obviously the Bible's not true. Now, immediately, someone who believes in the Bible and they believe that God's word is first, we see that and we're like, well, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, that gap is when the aftermath of Joshua defeating Jericho. Obviously, there's going to be a gap when there's no dwelling going on in the city. But they don't, because they are so set firmly that this timeline has to be accurate. It has to follow these specific events and these specific years, that when it doesn't match up, they then discard the Bible. So just a recap on that before we look at why and where the timeline came from. I think I just got this off of Wikipedia, to be honest. Scholars are virtually unanimous that the book of Joshua holds little historical value. Its origin lies in a time far removed from the time it depicts. So in other words, it was written much later. And its intention is primarily theological, detailing how Israel and her leaders are to be judged by their obedience to the teachings and laws, or the covenant, set down in the book of Deuteronomy. The story of Jericho and the conquest generally represents the nationalist propaganda of the kings of Judah and their claims to the territory of the kingdom of Israel after 722 BCE. So, again, it's all moral stories to teach the people how to live their lives. It's also some nationalist propaganda to show how strong they were when they came in and defeated the Canaanites, right? And they use it, and it's true today, to show their right to actually possess the land of Israel. So this is how our scholars look at that today. And the reason why is we go all the way back in time to this particular gentleman right here. So this is the gentleman that came along and started the problem that we have today, and the reason why they are so fixed in their timeline of Egyptian chronology. So if you don't recognize the picture, I personally wouldn't. This is Champollion. He was a famous French smart guy, polymath, I think he's called. And he did a lot of things, but one of the things he did was he was the one who finally finished translating the Rosetta Stone. There was another guy in England, his last name was Young, I believe, if memory serves, was also doing a lot of work, but Champollion was the one who came along and he finished translating the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone was this piece of archaeology that they found during the time of Napoleon. And what it allowed them to do was finally to read hieroglyphs. So for the longest time, they could be down in Egypt. They see all these beautiful things in the ground, all these carvings and inscriptions, but they really couldn't read any of it. They didn't know what was being done and being said in that time far removed. So on the Rosetta Stone, you have the Egyptian hieroglyphs, then you have Egyptian cursive, which is like an Egyptian alphabet, and then you have Greek. And it's the same story in every single thing. So if you can translate the Greek, well, then you can translate the next steps and understand the symbols and signs that the hieroglyphs were used for. So a lot of it is just sounds that you see in those symbols. So this was an amazing thing. And you can imagine Champollion, who was a Bible believer, he got really excited because now he can read hieroglyphs. This is for the first time in history. And this is why he's called the father of modern Egyptology, was because he allowed this huge advancement in that field. So he got really excited because remember back then, it was all about proving the Bible true. That was their motivation. So he went across and down into Egypt to try to find some stuff to read and to find evidence of whatever he could about the Bible and other things in history. So when he went down there, he came across in Karnak, which is a large city down in Egypt. It was a center of religious worship, but also a place where you would have lots of hieroglyphs depicting reigns of the Pharaoh and some of their great achievements. And when he came down there, he's reading through the different hieroglyphs. He comes across the name of a pharaoh, and the name of the pharaoh is Shoshank. And again, because he was thinking about the Bible, that was his motivation, his mind went to 1 Kings 11, verse 40. Just after Solomon's death, you have that situation with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. and Jeroboam is allied with Egypt, and Egypt comes up and they do some damage into Jerusalem, taking away a lot of the things from the temple. So he finds this, and that Pharaoh in 1 Kings 11 verse 40 is named Shoshank. Now, to say that Shoshank and Shoshank are the same person is very believable. Like, it's not far-fetched to see that as language translates to different languages, that some sounds and letters turn a little bit, and we see lots of evidence that in archaeology. It's not far-fetched. It was very much of a believable thing to go to. So he shot, Shoshank, Shoshank. I found evidence of the Bible. And he goes through and he reads this thing, and he comes across one of these hieroglyphs, and it's this one here. And what he reads there is the kingdom of Judah. So he sees in the list of the things that Shoshank had done something to do with the kingdom of Judah. And heretofore, you don't see references to places like Judah back then in archaeology, right? A lot of that stuff we see today is in the last 75 years where they found references to Judah and to Israel and the house of David, etc. So when he see this, he was really excited, and it matches what he saw in 1 Kings 11 of what Shoshank did in going into the kingdom of Judah. And because he found this, and he found this in this beautiful relief, and has dates, and they know when it happened, well, then from that point on, they use that to help establish the chronology of Egypt. Because once they knew that, here's this guy, this is Shoshank Shoshank, he did these things, it matches up to this Bible passage, and they can now use Solomon's reign to date the rest of Egypt. So it became a starting point to really fixing the Egyptian chronology. Now, when they did that, it ran into some problems. So basically what happened was Egyptologists used the Bible, and that reference to Shoshank, to start the date of the 22nd dynasty to 945 BC. So this is how we dated that dynasty. Then they date Ramses II based on that 22nd dynasty date. They then find no evidence for the Exodus and the conquest in the time of Ramses. So then they reject the Bible as a work of pious fiction. Basically, they use the Bible to establish Egyptian chronology, but that chronology is then used to dismiss the Bible as fact. So it's a circular argument they have got themselves into, but they are so set in their ways because of the work that Champollion did way back then. And now it's become a paradigm. It is set. Like when you go to archaeology school, you learn this stuff about Egyptian chronology. This is how it is. There's no argument here. All the work of the past 150 years is based upon these principles, on that exact dating system. So to change that is not very easy, right? Because a lot of people are very invested in it, living and dead, right? Because they staked reputation. They've written books. They make money off all these things. So when you come along and say, I think that chronology is wrong. I don't think it's right because it's disproving the Bible. That's our reason, right? And we know it to be true. But it's really hard to change that in the minds of these so-called learned men. But that's the challenge. Now, the biggest problem when we look at Champollion and what he did with found this beautiful little hieroglyph that says the kingdom of Judah, about 15 years after, so it wasn't that far after, he died about 3 years later. About 15 years later, they found that he actually mistranslated that particular hieroglyph. And that's not debated. Like everyone agrees with that today. They agree that he mistranslated that one little relief, that one little hieroglyph. But everything else was good. They were fine with the Shoshank thing. They just said that one hieroglyph was off. Not a big deal. The rest of it's all good. So the reference to the kingdom of Judah is off, but everything else fits. So here we go. It's set in stone. We're going to use that to date everything else. Now, if you come over to Karnak today, which you can do, it's a really cool, it's a lot there to see. It's well preserved, as many things are in Egypt. So here's us walking towards the city of Karnak. And like I said, on the outer walls of the city, there is all the information about the pharaohs and their military conquests. So you go to a wall and you see a pharaoh, say Ramses, and you will see all the things that he accomplished, his strength, his military might. He conquered so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. It's basically their walls of bragging. It's their wall of fame, as it were. And as you go inside the city, and into some of the inner rooms, you see more religious hieroglyphs depicting all their worship, all the many gods, some of their cultic stuff, how they worship the dead, or all that kind of stuff. So what we're concerned about is the outer walls, because we want to look at some of the things that the pharaohs did, specifically this Pharaoh Shoshank. So we come around to the one side, and we see this hieroglyph, and again, very well preserved. A lot of it you can still see. The big figure there you see on the screen, that is, I think it's Ra or Amun, and he showing him towing away captives from Shoshank's work. So there he is. You can see in his hand there, he's got chains, and the chains are attached to all those little figures on the wall, because it shows the might. And like any good religious person, he's attributing the glory of his battles to his God, right? And saying, look, by the power of Amun, I was able to defeat all my enemies, and here's what I was able to do. So as we go through and we see, there's the chains and there's all the different captives. Each captive is really a city, right? It's an area he conquered and plundered and put into tribute. And again, all the glory that he was able to accomplish and assemble to himself. Now, when we look a little closer at these different release, and here's some that we see. I think the one on the far right there actually is that one that we talked about earlier that Champollion mistranslated. Now when you go through it, it's done in order, so you could follow this, and I can't remember the way the fancy word is called. It's the B bub. Anyways, you read it like you'd plow a field. So you go to the end, go down, then this way, like this. So you don't read it like lines on a page. You read it like the ox plows the field. You go back and forth. And that's a common writing style that you would find in Egypt. And it goes in order of the Pharaoh's conquests as he goes up through the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and the different cities he conquers. And if you could have really good eyesight and you can read some of those on the screen, you'll recognize many of the places. 15 is Shunem, 16 is Bet-Shean, Mahanaim is 22, Gibeon is 23, Beth Horon is 24. So these are places we recognize, and here they are written in the hieroglyphs. So we know he's in the land of Israel. He's somewhere in there doing all this work and conquering different cities. But the area that we care about, the area where Champollion made his mistake and translated it as the kingdom of Judah, that's 29. That was the one he made a mistake on. So you see 27 is Megiddo, then Adar is 28, and then 29 he thought was the kingdom of Judah. But it's not. It means the hand of the king or the king's monument. So it would have been some sort of monument area that a king had set up that he plundered as well. So sort of some other place that, whether it was a pharaoh or a king of Israel set up, he went along and plundered it and took stuff from it. And then you keep going. 30 is Hebel, 31 is Hanam, 32 is Aruna. All these places in this list, so Megiddo being the easiest one to recognize, are up kind of like the northeast from Jerusalem, up along the coast, kind of near Mount Carmel area. And that's where we see all these places on the map. Here's a closer look, sorry it's a little blurry, of all the different places that this pharaoh took over. So it does not mean the kingdom of Judah. It meant the hand of the king or the king's monument. So if we take all these different places that this pharaoh conquered and put them on a map, we can see exactly the places that he went. So here's the map. This is all the places that this pharaoh Shoshank went and conquered. So here, follow the red line. He goes up the coastline through the land of the Philistines by Ashkelon, Ashdod, etc. Comes into Gezer, Plazulan, and Ajalon, and Bethel, and Gibeon. Then he goes up to Shechem, Tirzah, down to Adam, over across to Mahanaim, back up to Bet-Shean, Shunem, Tanakh, etc. That was the journey he took as he went and conquered all of these cities, right? And saying, look, here's how strong I was. Here's all the things that I did as a mighty pharaoh. Look at my power. It was his bragging right. It was the record of his life to show how powerful he was as a pharaoh. So if you were going to show how powerful you were, you'd want to make sure that you showed it in the best possible way, right? You would highlight all of your best victories and all your most amazing things. Now, if this Shoshank is in fact Pharaoh Shishak of this time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, well, we read about Shishak in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, that Shishak, king of Egypt, came against Jerusalem because they had transgressed against Yahweh. Now, if you were going to brag about any city in the land of Israel that you defeated, I'm pretty sure that Jerusalem would be number one on the list, because here's the capital, here's the biggest, strongest city, right? This is the one that there's been problems with all throughout human history, trying to conquer and defeat. But yet when we go through his journey, all of his places that he put into tribute, there is no mention of Jerusalem. And in fact, as we go through that list, we don't really go. We go around Jerusalem, don't we? We really go around the land of Judah is what we're doing, up around Judah, then up into northern Israel, into Ephraim, Zebulun, etc. His journey, his military campaign, did not put him anywhere near the places that Shoshank went. And not only did Shoshank go up against Jerusalem, but we also read in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 9 that Shoshank, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He took it all. He carried away also the shield of gold, the 300 shield of gold that Solomon had made. So again, this is a bragging right of how powerful you are and all the things that you've taken away into tribute. Why would you omit the best of it all? Why would you omit all the things you took out of God's house? All the things you took out of Solomon's house, the house of the king. None of that is recorded on that wall in Karnak because this Pharaoh, Shoshank, didn't do those things. He didn't go to Jerusalem. He didn't really go to Judah at all. A little bit of raiding there at the bottom in the blue, and Hebron and Beersheba. But really, he avoided Judah almost completely. He spent all his time focused on conquering in the land of Israel. But that makes no sense to the record of Shoshank. Because remember, Shoshank and Jeroboam were friends. Remember, Jeroboam ran away from Solomon, went down to Egypt, and Shoshank basically sheltered he would have grown up under Shoshank. And then later on, as Jeroboam and Rehoboam are fighting, Jeroboam says, I need some help. And Shoshank comes up to help Jeroboam against Rehoboam. But in this map, on that wall, it's the exact opposite. It's the destruction of Israel, not the destruction of Judah. Those pharaohs aren't the same people. And if those pharaohs aren't the same, well, that changes the chronology of Egypt. It changes how we look at things and how things match up when we don't have those two set points to kind of line up Egypt and Israel. Now they're different. Now, we're not going to go into this, but I give you some links to look at it. But there's some good evidence by an archaeologist named David Rohl, who's not even religious. He's just an agnostic. We'll talk about him again later, but he does like to use the Bible as a historical fact, but doesn't really believe in as far as the truth. Anyways, he shows with some interesting looking at history that Shoshank, that Shoshank actually lines up to Ramses. So the pharaoh that we think is the Exodus and the movies all depict with the old Brenner, etc., as the pharaoh at Moses' time is in fact probably the pharaoh in the time of Solomon and Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It's the Shoshank mentioned in the Bible, and maybe we can talk about that later, but we'll leave that for now. So what we have seen, though, I think really simply just looking at this map, that the story of Shoshank does not match the story of Shoshank in our Bibles. They're not talking about the same individual. It was really interesting that because Egyptian records are so well kept, that's why they always go back to Egypt, because look, they have good records, right? Hotter climate, the sandstone, all that kind of stuff. These things are preserved really well in history. So a lot of other cultures, Israel being one, Hittites, even Greece, Cyprus, all these different cultures, they base their chronology off of Egypt's. They look for times that sync up, and then they base off that because the records were so much better preserved down in Egypt. Now, what happens, though, when you do that, and they see this, is that it creates all these dark periods in chronologies. There are all these periods that they can't really explain. They're not sure how long they are, but there's these gaps, and they call them dark ages or dark periods in all these chronologies that are based off of Egypt's. Right? Here's some examples of different ones that we have problems with. Cyprus, Troy, Nubia, Greece, Syria, Phoenicia, and Hittites. All of them, as you see there on the right of the screen, the yellow line goes into a gap, and they call it the dark period. And it creates that problem because they're using the Egyptian chronology that has a problem itself. So if the chronology of Egypt has a problem, it's going to create problems in everything else that is based off of it. But what happens when you start to fix some of those problems with Egyptian chronology? So in this very easy to understand timeline, at the top we have conventional Egyptian chronologies. This is the same thing that they taught in schools for the last 100 years. Then you have the new Egyptian chronology in the middle and biblical chronology below. So when you compare these things, what we want to focus on just really briefly is the far right of conventional Egyptian chronology. It says TIP 21st to 25th dynasties. TIP stands for the third intermediary period. So there's three dark ages in Egyptian chronology, the first, second, and third intermediary periods. Again, they have lots of information about these times in history, but it's really jittered and scrabbled. You read one guy, he might put this pharaoh, then that pharaoh, then this one. The other one might reverse the order. Some will have one pharaoh ruling down south and one pharaoh ruling up north at the same time, and some will put them side by side, or separately, sorry. So in these intermediary periods, there's just these gaps, these darker periods of history in Egypt. And now what some archaeologists, like the one we mentioned, David Rohl, and others like Brian Wood, they suggested that that third intermediary period is just, it's too long. There's a lot of pharaohs that they've placed into there, just basically they just chuck them into there and they can't figure out where to put them. They have them all ruling separately, so it increases the length of that intermediary period. But if you look through that and put a little bit more study into it, what pharaohs existed in that period of time, and you realize that some of them are existing at the same time, right? Again, north or south, some in the middle, as Egypt is pretty long and drawn out, then you start to see that there's really, you can compress that time of history. And they've taken off 330 years out of that intermediary period. And you remove that 330 years, things change. And when you remove that 330 years, all those other timelines that we saw, right, these ones, all their dark ages almost totally disappear when you remove that 330 years. So it doesn't just help with Egyptian chronology, it's going to help with everybody else. And when we do that, we have this new Egyptian chronology. So whereas before, you see the Exodus lines up to the 18th dynasty, which is Ramses II. When you compress that intermediary period, now you have the Exodus lining up with the 12th dynasty, right? And the 12th dynasty / 13th dynasty, that's what happens just before the second intermediary period of Egyptian chronology, where you have a group of people reign in Egypt who are called the Hyksos, and we'll talk really briefly about them. I think maybe actually, no, not yet. So when you shift that and move that around a little bit, and you line up a little better, then you have a new place where Moses leaves Egypt and a new Pharaoh. So now there's a new time in history where to dig. Right? Before we were digging in the 18th dynasty, now we're going to dig around in the 12th dynasty. You notice though, the time in the year doesn't change, same year, it's just in a different dynasty. I'm looking for different art, different writings, different reference points that associate with those pharaohs of the 12th and 13th dynasties in Egypt. Now, there's interesting, there's a Jewish historian who wrote around the time of the Septuagint, and he wrote down in Alexandria. He was writing for the Ptolemies, and he's recording things that happened in Israel and Egypt, more Egypt actually than Israel. And he's writing about things that happened. And his writings don't exist today, maybe burned in the fire of Alexandria, but he is referenced in other writers. So one of the places he's referenced in is Clement of Alexandria. So Clement is the church father, church historian. He wrote a lot, did a lot of work. In his book called Stomata, in the 23rd chapter, he says this about the work of Artapanus, who was this Egyptian historian. Artapanus wrote that Moses, being shut up in custody by Khenophares, king of the Egyptians, on account of the people demanding to let go of Egypt. So what this writer does, Artapanus, and if you look into some of Artapanus' writing, there's a lot of nonfiction there as well, very glorified looking at Egypt. But he does make this connection between the Pharaoh Khenophares and Moses as being the same at the same time. So it gives a name to the Pharaoh that exists during the time that Moses is trying to leave Exodus, or maybe that when Moses was growing up in Exodus. And he also accounts when Moses went down into Ethiopia and Libya and some of the battles that he may or may not have fought while he grew up in Pharaoh's house. So when you take all these things into account, we have this timeline here that gives us an idea of the different pharaohs in the 12th and 13th dynasty that line up to our story of Moses and the Exodus. So that name we saw there, Khenophares, it can only refer to actually one pharaoh as far as they can tell in history. And it's this guy here, Khenophere Sobek-hotep, the fourth. That pharaoh is the only one who had that particular name used. Now, one thing about pharaohs is they have more than one name. They often have a birth name, they have a religious name, and they have a coronation name that they get when they're crowned king. And they're all slightly different, and they all have different ideas that you can look at. But this pharaoh, Khenophere Sobek-hotep, Khenophere was his coronation name. And says there, he was called Khenopheres by Artapanus and Nephkropheres by Menetheo. Menetheo is another Egyptian historian that we're going to read about if we have time in a bit. I don't know what time it is. We got 15 minutes. So Moses was thought to be born in the reign of Khenopheres. Then if you go down, you come to this pharaoh Dudamos, some 40 years later, which makes sense. That Dudamos is thought to be the pharaoh that Moses leaves the Exodus in. And we're going to see in a few minutes that Dudamos is mentioned in Manetho's writings as the pharaoh being present when Egypt collapses, when everything gets lost, which makes sense if you go through the 10 plagues and you lose your whole army to the Red Sea crossing. So this is how things would fall into place with this adjusted chronology, and this is how Moses would exist in the two main parts of his life: his birth in the time of Khnafri Sobekotep, and when he leaves Egypt some 40 years later, well, I guess some 80 years later, really, in the time of Dudamos, right? Now, one of the things that, because this chronology, conventional chronology, has been around forever, we as Christadelphians, we've used it in our classes throughout the last 100 years, and we refer to it. And one of the things that it pointed out is that there's this group of people called the Hyksos, and you might have heard of that phrase. I thought we'd just quickly talk about it. And in conventional Egyptian archaeology, the Hyksos exist before Israel leaves Egypt. And it was thought at one point that Hyksos meant the shepherd kings. And it was suggested by many Bible scholars, find many Christadelphian writings about this earlier, that the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, were in reference to Joseph, and the fact that because they came down from the north and they ruled in the land of Egypt. We know that in one way Joseph did rule in Egypt. And that's kind of it was a common belief amongst religious scholars for a very long time. Bible believers, they used that, and they talked about the Hyksos being a reference to Jacob and Joseph and their family as they ruled in Egypt. Now, Hyksos does not mean shepherd kings, as was once thought. Here's a picture of some Hyksos on a hieroglyph or on a cave painting. The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian Hekakawasat, which means foreign rulers, and was used by Egyptians to describe the kings of nearby areas. So Hyksos weren't just the people that ruled in Egypt. They were any foreign king that existed outside of Egypt that wasn't an Egyptian pharaoh. They called them Hyksoses. So they're foreign rulers. When you change the chronology and you adjust that 330 years, it puts the Hyksos in power in Egypt. So they're a foreign ruler that come into Egypt and rule in Egypt for a period of time. It puts them into rulership in Egypt right after Moses leaves. And we'll read a quote from Manetho, hopefully in a few minutes, that talks about how when they came down into Egypt, they found it defenseless, right? They lost the country without even fighting a war. And we know the reason for that, don't we? That Pharaoh and his army were swallowed up in the Red Sea, and there was no army to defend Egypt. There was no economy to speak of because the plagues had wiped out their economy. And obviously we know the firstborns have been dead in every household. So all these things that happened to Egypt, making it ripe for the picking. Israel leaves, also hurting the economy, and they go up north, and someone from an outside land then come down into Egypt and ruled there for a few hundred years until the Egyptians from the south finally pushed them out under a pharaoh named Amos. All that takes place, all that fits in. They weren't shepherd kings. And in fact, what we read about the Hyksos as rulers, they weren't just rulers, they were like kings. They were fierce, they were abusive. The way they're described in Egyptian history is not pleasant, not the way you would describe Joseph and what he did, right? He wasn't really a king. He was a vizier, advisor to the king, and he helped organize things to save the people in the 7 years of famine, but he didn't rule the nation as these Hyksos did. So the Hyksos, really quickly, are not Israel. They might have been the Amalekites, maybe. They were wandering around the wilderness at the same time. They could have went down a little south and took over the land, but they were definitely foreign rulers who conquered and lived in Egypt for about 200 years. All right, so this is where a lot of the work is being done today. It's being done by an archaeologist by the name of Manfred Bietek. He's from Dutch or Netherlands or somewhere over there, past you guys. And he's excavating in the Nile, up north in the Nile Delta, in the place of Goshen, really, where Joseph was given a place for his family to live in the time of the Pharaoh, Amenemhat, which maybe we'll have time to look at. So because archaeologists are looking at conventional archaeology, they're looking in the city of Ramses to find evidence for Israel being there, looking for Semitic people living in Ramses that were servants or slaves and that then left. And because they find no evidence there, they obviously discard the Bible. But if we realize that you shouldn't be looking the time of Ramses. You should be looking earlier in Egyptian history. You need to dig deeper, because obviously in history, you see it all over Israel. You just build things on top of things. So the farther down you go, so if you're walking through Jerusalem, right, you go in some of those deep spots where you can go down really low, and you can go down lower and lower into history in the time of David and Solomon or earlier, depending how far down you are in that pit or that well that you're in. The same is true in Egypt. So if you dig a little deeper, below Ramses, you find the city of Avarus. And the city of Avarus was a city that existed during the time of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th dynasties in Egypt. And they found a lot of really amazing things there. In fact, Mr. Bitek, he found that the city of Avarus was populated by a large Semitic-speaking people. Semitic just meaning the ones who come from Canaan and more north as well. He found all this stuff, but again, they discarded it as coincidence because it didn't fit their timeline, but they do find evidence of it. And they find it in burials, they find it in the pottery and in some of the other things they made. They find it even in the sheep themselves, because the long-haired sheep of Semitic peoples is different than the sheep you'd find down in the land of Egypt. Anyways, you find all this evidence for people from Canaan in this city of Avarus. And not only do they find evidence of a Semitic people, they also find a lot of other really curious things. So if we try to say that Israel was never in the land of Egypt, well, there's a lot of things in Avarus that would seem to contradict that. So it's been said that the Exodus is not a historical event, and the Hebrews were never there, that is there in Egypt, the number described. And yet, at the city of Avarus, in the Egyptian Delta, they found the city grew with great speed. It wasn't just a city that gradually grew, it grew really quickly to be one of the biggest in the ancient world, and it had a large Semitic-speaking population right around the time the Bible places Israel in Egypt. So what else would there be other than Israel and Joseph, etc., growing there? And we know from Bible that they grew and they multiplied very quickly. So they grew from a family of 12 sons into a huge nation that left together under Moses in the Exodus. Also at Avarus, you see this. If an Exodus never happened, then why do we have evidence for 2 Semitic cities in Egypt abandoning their dwellings almost overnight? And where do these impoverished people and slaves go? So they found Avarus is one that's done the most work. They found another one, I think it's to the southwest of there, of another Semitic city that they found. And they found evidence, again, just looking in the ground and looking at what's left in that level, of people just leaving. They're just gone almost overnight. And we know it literally was overnight as they left at the Passover. Also at Avarus, we see a massive spike in the death of infant boys under 1 year old, accounting for nearly 50% of all the deaths for boys under 10. So at the city of Avarus, they look to the graves and they see these spikes in babies dying. Now, there's obviously in that time in history, a large number of infants die as it is, but they see an inordinate amount of infants dying at this time. And not only that, but they were male predominantly. And again, we look at our Bibles and recognize that, well, yes, there was males dying and a large number of infants because the Pharaoh said, kill all the infant boys. Now, if you see a large number of infant boys dying, what are you going to see 20, 30, 40 years later? Well, you also see in Avarus an imbalance in the burials of men and women. The burials of women become disproportionate to that of the men. And again, does that fit the biblical narrative we see? Well, yes. When Moses was a baby, they were killing most of all the men, children. Well, then 40 years later, as people begin to die, you're going to see more women buried than men because the population would have been skewed for a few years, for a generation, basically. And they do see that in the burials at Avarus. Also in Avarus, because remember, they're saying Israel probably was never in Egypt. The captivity never happened. Now, this is the Brooklyn Papyrus. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus because that's where it's housed currently, and that's where they sat down and deciphered it. It was a piece of paper they found in the city around the area of Avarus, and it lists Egyptian noblemen and his household slaves. These are a list of all the different slaves he had under his power, people he had to do whatever needed being done. Now, in this list of names, they can't translate all of them because some of them is faded away. But in what they can translate, they found the following names: Shiphrah, Asher, Manaam, Issachar 3 times, and a bunch of other Semitic names. Now, obviously, the one that jumps out is Shiphrah. I'm not suggesting, although it would be really interesting if it was the same shipper that we read about in the Bible, as there would have been many women that had the same name, right? But here we have Semitic slaves listed in an Egyptian house in the city of Avarus. Again, giving us evidence that not only was there Semitic people there, but they were also servants and slaves to the Egyptians. So here's a quote from David Roll. I mentioned him earlier. He says, how do we determine where the Exodus falls in the historical timeline? This is his suggestion. You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that's where you'll find Moses in the Exodus. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because we know, because of the 10 plagues and the Red Sea crossing, that would have been an utter collapse in Egyptian society. So if you could find where in Egyptian history that collapse took place, then start looking for evidence of Moses leaving Egypt with Israel, and maybe it'll work. And that's what he's done. He's done that, and he's found the evidence. Here's a quote from that guy we mentioned earlier, Manetho, ancient Egyptian historian. I think he wrote actually around the time of Josephus. Josephus was writing about Israel. He's writing about Egypt. He says that there was a king of ours whose name was Timaeus, or that's the Greek, and in Egypt it'd be Dudamus. Under him it came to pass that I don't know how that God was adverse to us. Notice it says God and not gods. Again, in Egypt we have multiple gods, don't we? We have God for almost everything. But here, God was adverse to them. And there came, after a surprising manner, men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, who had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country. So after God was adverse to us, these people came from the east into our country, Hyksos. And with ease, they subdued it by force, yet without our hazarding a battle with them. So here we are, the mighty Egyptian empire didn't even put up a fight when the Hyksos came in. So when they had gotten those that had governed us under their power, they afterwards burnt down our cities, demolished the temples of the gods. So here's plural gods, because that's what they believed in, and used all the inhabitants after a most barbarous manner. Nay, some they slew and led their children and wives into slavery. So here's Manetho writing about these things. And I'm not saying Manetho, by the way, is the most accurate Egyptian scholar. If you read his writings, there's a lot of muddled stuff in there, similar to when you dive into Josephus, right? But he does talk about this pharaoh, Timaeus, associated with a time in Egyptian history was a collapse. There's no army to protect the nation, right? It was a nation in disarray. They'd gone through all these plagues, right? Losing their livestock, right? People dying. All these things had happened. Their whole army goes out and goes for a swim and never returns. It's defenseless. And we think, well, even that last plague, right? That 10th plague, that would have been crazy to see the firstborn die in every single family. Oftentimes the firstborn is not just one of the kids. That's one of the ones in a position of leadership, position of power, authority. All of a sudden you'll lose all that leadership. They're all dead. It was interesting in the time, around this time, look at Avarus, and remember Avarus being a city in the Delta, Goshen, but also there was Egyptian dwellings all around, right? And when they look there, they find these plague pits, these mass burials of people just thrown in. Now, we know Egyptians have great respect for the dead. In fact, it's one of the ways they can tell when it's Egyptian burials and Semitic burials is how they're buried. Semitic people are often buried on their side in a fetal position, whereas Egyptian burials, you have their hands crossed like this, or their hands palms out at their side. But what they found was all these Egyptians buried and literally just like they were thrown into pits. Like there was some plague that ran through the land, and they had to get rid of all these dead bodies overnight, as it were. Now, we don't believe it was a plague. We believe it was the hand of God. And we believe that the firstborn died all at once. And you know, all these dead bodies to bury. And it makes a lot of sense. You just dig these pits and be throwing them in haphazardly. Not with the order and dignity that they normally would bury somebody, but they just literally threw them into these pits. Again, all around the same time in history. I think we're pretty much out of time. I'll just quickly recap this last timeline. The next week, or 2 weeks, I guess, we'll pick up in the time of Joseph and then kind of look at Gilgal and Jericho. But so when we fix this timeline, this is how everything would line up. So starting at the bottom, the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat III would have been the pharaoh of Joseph's time. And we don't have time to look at him this evening, but we will maybe a little bit in a few weeks. And then the 13th dynasty is the time of the sojourn, as in when Joseph's family is living in Egypt and they're having children and they're multiplying very quickly. And then at the end of the 13th dynasty, you come across Sobahotep IV. That's that one we looked at earlier, as well as Dudamos. And these are the pharaohs during Moses' time, Dudamos being the one that Pharaoh Moses left during. Then you have the Hyksos period in Egyptian history, and that lines up to the time of the wilderness wanderings, as well as the time of the judges, when Egypt wasn't a power, right? We don't read of, it's funny, when you think of all the time of the judges, Egypt's not the one often coming up and doing all the damage for a while, right? They're sort of off the scene in the time of the judges. Anyways, so the Hyksos period, then you come to the 15th dynasty where Apophis, Amos, they sort of pushed off the Hyksos, and then you go into the 18th dynasty, and you come across this pharaoh, Akhenaten, right? And you might have heard the name Akhenaten. It's another one of the places that the Bible critics go to say the Bible isn't true. See, because you look at conventional chronology, Akhenaten is Pharaoh before Moses. Now, what stands out about Akhenaten is he was a pharaoh that believed in a singular God. He was a monotheistic pharaoh, whereas every other pharaoh is polytheistic. So what some of the Bible critics will say, look, Moses didn't even come up with this on his own. He got these ideas from Akhenaten. Akhenaten also wrote a prayer to his God, a song. And it's very similar to Psalm 107. So another thing they say is that not only did Akhenaten inspire Moses to be monotheistic, he also, David also basically copied off of him to write one of his Psalms in Psalm 107, because he wrote it hundreds of years before David ever came across. Now, when you compare the two Psalms, I'm not sure that it's ironclad that they're identical, but there are some similarities between the two Psalms. But when you rearrange the chronology, well, now Akhenaten goes up a whole bunch of years, and he falls right in line with David. And I'd like to believe, and I think there might be some truth in it, that David and Samuel, in there, as they brought the truth across the nation of Israel, and Israel became such an amazing power in the world, that monotheistic belief might have spread. And that would have been because of David, that Akhenaten, and Samuel, that Akhenaten picked up on this idea of one God. And that he might have read Psalm 107 and then copied it in a hymn to his own singular God. Anyways, that would fix that problem, though, that some critics might have. And then you come to the 19th dynasty and get into Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and Ramses II being Pharaoh Shoshank of Kings and Chronicles. So we will we'll leave it there, and hopefully we can pick up, Lord willing, in a couple weeks and look at some other stories and how this chronology affects how we view things like Joshua and Joseph. So I'll turn back over to you, Brother Luke.